The German prisoner sat in the back of the lorry, hands bound, watching the English countryside roll past. He heard voices outside. Clear, perfect, German. Not the broken textbook German of interrogators. Not the crude phrases shouted across no man's land. This was the German of home. Of mothers calling children to supper. Of conversations in Berlin cafes. His escort hadn't spoken a word of it. The villagers had. "Are we in the wrong country?" The question left his lips before he could stop it. The British guard turned, smiled slightly, said nothing. The prisoner's certainty, the one thing that had survived capture, transport, the collapse of everything he'd been promised, began to crack. If he didn't know where he was, what else didn't he know? This was not supposed to happen. Germany had spent years preparing for a war it believed it understood. The calculations had been precise. France would fall quickly. It did. Britain would sue for peace. It didn't. The Soviet Union would crumble within months. It held. And America, distant, hesitant America, would stay out of Europe's blood-soaked affairs. Every assumption had proven wrong. By the time prisoners like him were being shuttled through British villages, the mathematics of war had inverted. Germany was no longer advancing. It was contracting. Not in sudden collapse, but in the slow, grinding way of a machine running out of fuel, running out of time, running out of the future it had promised itself. Britain had spent those same years transforming. Not just building tanks and planes, but building something stranger. Something the Wehrmacht hadn't anticipated. It had built a network, and that network spoke German. The prisoner had been told Britain was weak, exhausted, a fading empire clinging to past glories, defended by old men and boys with hunting rifles. The Blitz was supposed to have broken them. The U-boats were supposed to have starved them. Isolation was supposed to have made them desperate. Instead, he'd been captured during an air raid over the Ruhr. His Luftwaffe squadron, once masters of the sky, had been intercepted by RAF fighters that seemed to know exactly where they'd be. The debriefing had been unsettling. The interrogators knew things, unit numbers, recent transfers, names of commanders, that shouldn't have been possible. But it was the village that shattered him. The lorry had stopped for mechanical trouble. Nothing dramatic. A routine delay. The guards had let him stretch his legs under watch, standing in the centre of a small English village that looked like every propaganda image he'd ever seen. Stone cottages, a church, a pub called the King's Arms. Then he heard it. 2 women, elderly, walking past with shopping baskets, speaking German, not haltingly, not with the stiff grammar of evening classes. They spoke with the ease of natives, discussing rationing and the weather and someone's grandson in the Navy. He stared. One of them noticed, smiled kindly, switched to English without missing a beat. The guard said something to them. They laughed, moved on. "Who are they?" the prisoner asked. "Villagers," the guard replied. "But they've been here longer than you've been alive." The prisoner tried to process this. His training had never mentioned it. The intelligence briefings had never suggested it. How many Germans lived in Britain? How many had been here for decades, woven into the fabric of villages and cities, speaking both languages, living both lives? And if they were here, if they'd always been here, what had they been doing since the war began? The prisoner spent the rest of the journey trying to reconstruct his understanding of the enemy. Every war relies on distance. Physical distance, yes, but also the distance of otherness. The enemy must be foreign in every sense. Different soil, different tongue, different blood. That difference makes the machinery of war possible. It makes the killing imaginable. But what happened when the distance collapsed? What happened when the enemy spoke your language in your own accent? When they'd grown up singing the same songs, reading the same books, celebrating the same holidays? When the woman who smiled at you in a British village could have been your aunt, your teacher, your neighbour? The certainty required for war depended on not asking these questions. He was asking them now. And somewhere in London, in a building whose location would remain classified for decades, other people had been asking different questions entirely. How do you fight a war against an enemy whose communications you cannot read, against codes you cannot break, against strategies you cannot predict? You find people who can. You find the Germans who fled the Reich, the Jewish mathematicians and physicists who escaped on the last trains out of Berlin, the political dissidents who saw what was coming and got out while borders still meant something, the ordinary families who'd emigrated decades before, who'd built lives in Britain but never quite forgot the language of home. You find them, you recruit them, you train them, and you build an intelligence network that the enemy never saw coming because they never imagined their own language could be turned against them. The prisoner didn't know it, but he was part of a larger pattern. British intelligence had been refining its approach to captured Germans for years. The interrogations were careful, methodical, designed to extract not just tactical information, but psychological insight. What did ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers believe? What propaganda had reached them? What doubts were they afraid to voice? And crucially, what didn't they know? The gap between what Germany believed about Britain and what Britain actually was had grown into a chasm. Germany believed Britain was on the edge of starvation. British agriculture, supplemented by intensive wartime cultivation and rationing systems more sophisticated than anything the Reich had implemented, was holding. Not comfortably, not without sacrifice, but holding. Germany believed British morale was cracking. The bombing campaigns that were supposed to break civilian will had instead hardened it. The shared suffering had created a unity that peacetime Britain had never quite managed. The prisoner had seen it in the faces of his guards, not hatred, not fear. Something worse. Determination. Germany believed Britain was alone. It wasn't. The Atlantic lifelines, nearly severed by U-boats in the dark years, had been secured through technological adaptation and brutal persistence. Aid flowed. Intelligence flowed. And across every mile of ocean, the noose around Germany tightened. The prisoner had believed all of it. Every word, every promise, every assurance that victory was inevitable, that the British were defeated in all but name, that it was only a matter of time. Time had proven otherwise. What the prisoner had witnessed wasn't an accident. Throughout Britain, in villages and cities, among factory workers and university professors, were thousands of native German speakers. Some had been there for generations. Others had arrived in desperate flights from persecution. Many had family still in Germany, family they would never see again. They had made a choice, not an easy one, not one without cost. They had chosen to use their language, their insider knowledge, their understanding of German culture and psychology against the Reich. Some worked in intelligence, translating intercepted communications, identifying linguistic patterns that revealed unit movements or strategic intentions. Others worked in psychological operations, crafting propaganda designed to exploit the specific fears and doubts of German soldiers. A few, in ways that would remain classified for decades, worked on projects that went far beyond simple translation. They were Britain's secret native speakers, and Germany had no equivalent. The Reich had spent years purging difference, expelling brilliance, driving out anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable. Those people hadn't vanished. They'd gone to Britain, to America, to anywhere that would take them, and they'd brought their knowledge with them. The prisoner, sitting in that lorry, hearing perfect German spoken in an English village, was encountering the consequences of his nation's choices. Every scientist driven out, every intellectual forced to flee, every family that had looked at the Reich's promises and decided survival meant leaving everything behind. They had left. They had adapted. They had survived. And now they were part of the machinery working against him. The interrogation, when it came, was not what he expected. The room was plain. A table, 2 chairs, a window showing another slice of English countryside. The interrogator entered, sat down, opened a folder. "Your name is already confirmed," he said in German. Perfect German. The accent was Saxon. "We're not here to verify what we already know." The prisoner said nothing. "We're here because you have a choice to make." This was new. The prisoner had been trained to expect threats, tricks, appeals to survival. Not this. Not a choice. Germany is losing, the interrogator continued. Not a taunt, a statement of fact. Not today, not tomorrow. But the trajectory is clear. You can see it if you're willing to look. The Eastern Front is holding, then pushing back. The Atlantic is secured, North Africa is lost, Italy is crumbling, and every day more bombers reach deeper into Germany. The prisoner wanted to object, wanted to recite the propaganda he'd been fed. But the words stuck in his throat, because he'd seen the evidence himself, the interceptions that shouldn't have been possible, the precision of Allied attacks, the way the RAF seemed to be waiting for them, every time, in exactly the right position. "You're wondering how we knew," the interrogator said. "How we always know. You've been wondering since you were shot down how British fighters were there, how they knew your route, your altitude, your timing." Silence. "We know because Germany taught us. Every scientist you expelled, every mathematician you drove out, every mind you wasted, because it didn't fit your definition of purity. They came here, they came to us, and they brought everything they knew." The interrogator closed the folder. "You can't win a war when you've given your enemy your best weapons." The prisoner was returned to the camp that evening. He didn't speak during the journey, didn't respond to the attempts at conversation from other prisoners. He lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling and tried to hold on to certainty. It wouldn't hold, because once you've seen the gap between what you were told and what is true, you can't unsee it. Germany had promised victory through strength, through racial purity, through the elimination of weakness and difference. And in doing so, it had eliminated the very people who might have made victory possible. The scientists, the cryptographers, the linguists, the thinkers who saw problems from angles the Reich couldn't imagine. Britain hadn't won by being stronger. It had won by being smarter about what strength meant. It had won by taking in the people Germany threw away. And now those people, speaking German in British villages, working in British intelligence offices, living British lives while remembering German childhoods, were the architects of Germany's unraveling. The prisoner thought about his village, the one he'd left behind, the one he'd assumed would be there, unchanged, waiting for his triumphant return. He wondered if it still existed, wondered if the promises that had sent him to war had protected it or doomed it, wondered how many other soldiers in how many other camps were starting to ask the same questions. The war didn't end because of one prisoner's realization. It ended because of millions of small defeats, compounding into something irreversible. Because of supply lines cut and codes broken, and intelligence gathered by people who understood both sides too well to believe either completely. It ended because Germany had spent years building a nation on the principle of exclusion, and exclusion has costs that don't show up in the initial calculations. The prisoner eventually went home, years later, to a Germany that had been bombed, occupied, divided, and fundamentally altered. The village of his childhood was still there, but it wasn't the same. Nothing was. He never forgot the moment in that British village, the sound of perfect German spoken by people who were supposed to be the enemy. The realization that the lines he'd been taught to believe in, between nations, between peoples, between us and them, were more fiction than truth. War requires those fictions. It requires the distance. But distance collapses when you hear your own language in enemy territory, when you realize the person interrogating you shares half your cultural memory, when you understand that the machinery working against you was built by the people your nation decided it didn't need. The question he'd asked, "Are we in the wrong country?" had a deeper answer than he'd imagined. He was in exactly the right country. He just didn't know it yet. And that gap between what soldiers believed and what was actually true, that gap between the propaganda and the reality, that gap between the promises and the consequences, that gap was where Germany lost the war. One realization at a time. In villages where the wrong language was spoken, by the right people,